Good morning. Welcome to the Point. After nearly 2 weeks of protest and demonstrations after the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, lawmakers in Michigan are starting to listen to some of those voices. Some legislation has already been passed, at least in one chamber. And we're having a conversation with two House members this morning, one Democrat and one Republican, about what they think should be done going forward. We start with Democratic State Representative David LaGrand from Grand Rapids. I was talking about what we'd seen in the outcropping of emotions and protest after the death of George Floyd, and you pointed out accurately that it wasn't just about that death, but it brought to light a conversation that you've been having for a very long time. So talk to me about what you're hearing from your constituents and where this conversation needs to go from here.
Sure. This conversation could not have come soon enough from my perspective. I've spent my career really focusing on criminal justice reform issues, and that's honestly only one part of what we have to talk about here. I think that a lot of my constituents are now being listened to. A lot of the community that I represent hasn't been listened to very well by people in power, and so I don't think the message is different. It's just that the reception is different, and that's great. Macrocosmically, I think there are three broad issues. One is the reality in America is that African Americans have a lot less wealth generally than Caucasian people do. About 10% the net wealth of the average white family. And that has real implications, and it's something we have to reckon with as a society. And frankly, I think it's something we have to address. Then more immediately, the question of how the police interact with our community, and particularly how they interact with communities of color. And there's a lot of room for improvement and for work there. And then the third issue is how our criminal justice system works when it's applied, and whether it's applied equally to everyone, and it's not. And even if it were applied equally, are we doing the things that we want to be doing? And so those are issues that I've been working on for decades, and many people in my community know those realities and can speak to them. I represent the core of Grand Rapids, and in the core of Grand Rapids, life is very different than it is in Ada. And fortunately now, those voices are being heard. And I think that there may be a moment here when, the dominant power structures in our culture really are listening with compassion and empathy in ways that they weren't before. And that's what I'm really hoping will happen here. Because once we have empathy, we can work towards change together.
You and I have had this conversation, not the same conversation, but the conversation about your work in trying to get criminal justice reform and some of the things you've worked on, and some, I should say, successfully, even in the past term. But there is so much more that people want to see done now. What is Lansing's capacity? I know, for example, over in the Senate, they've already dealt with some bills that would address police training, which may be part of that conversation. But what is the capacity to listen, grasp what is needed, and then act upon it? I mean, how much heavy lifting will that be?
So here's the really good news. The really good news is I've been working on cash bond reform for 3 years now. So this is a conversation that Lansing is ready to have because we've been having it. I've been working on decriminalization initiatives for years now. I've been working on sentencing guideline issues for years now. We've got an expungement package that I'm going to be, again, going to monitor its progress through the Senate tomorrow, which can give, the rallying cry of this movement has been, I can't breathe and your boot's on my neck. Well, one way that people can't breathe in my community, and one way they feel the boot on their neck, is convictions from their past that employers won't let go of, that our community won't let go of. And what we have to do is have a road towards getting people's criminal convictions cleaned up. That's called expungement. We are close. That is going for a hearing in the Senate. It passed out of the House overwhelmingly. Cleaning up criminal history is going to be, if we pass this, will be the most important anti-poverty thing we will have done in Michigan in my lifetime. We can help as many as 1 million people we can become a national leader. And if we actually want to help people who are in poverty and who lack power, this is probably the single most important thing we can do right now. Now, do not for a moment mean to minimize the conversations we have to have about the dynamics of law enforcement and transitioning our model of community policing to one of engagement and not one of confrontation. And that's going to take work, but I think we all see where the work needs to go, and there are lots of exciting possibilities there. But right now, there are major initiatives that are going to help tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of people. Cash bond, for example, is a huge disruptor in the lives of the poor and the lives of people in my community. We need to massively reduce our reliance on cash bond in our justice system. And we can do it. And I've got a package I introduced this session. It's ready to go. We need to take that up and we need to move it. But my colleagues have had these conversations. We're ready to have these conversations, I think. So I am really hopeful that now is the time we can implement some of these packages that are already there and already ready to go.
There is a conversation about what to do about the funding of police departments. And I know in Grand Rapids, they had a conversation on Wednesday, had a news conference and talked about some of the things that they're going to do. And the city manager said that they had already moved some money for oversight and other things within the department. What is your take on some of the moves to defund or fund at a lower level for policing?
Well, first of all, I think you have to be specific when you talk about those things. So I have very little appetite for buying more of the kind of assault weaponry that we saw in the images from Ferguson, for example. We don't need armored cars running around my community. That being said, I think from my perspective, it's sometimes a question of what we need more of. So I firmly believe we need more intervention type policing, and that means community policing. A really good article in MLive which pointed out there was that really bad situation where a bunch of young men were ordered to the ground at gunpoint a few months ago, and the MLive article pointed out if those officers had played pickup basketball with those kids the week before, they would have known them and they would have known they weren't a threat. So we have to get our officers they've got to get more engaged and more embedded in the community. One of the things I think we should be pushing for is officers who are living in the communities that they serve. The last thing we want is a dynamic of a militarized force driving into town to start their workday and then going home at the end of the day to a community that's not ours. So we need to be working on incentivizing officers to live in town. We need to be diversifying our force, of course, on gender lines and race lines. I mean, there are a lot of things we need to do here. So I actually think that talking about defunding is not the right way to frame this conversation. I think the better way to frame it is, what do we need? And let's fund that. And are there things we just clearly don't need, like, over-militarized paramilitary paraphernalia, and let's defund that. So not defunding law enforcement generally. I mean, if we have a barricaded gunman situation in town, we need people who have the skill set to respond to that. When we get a domestic violence call from somebody who's actively being assaulted, we need people who have the skill set to respond to that. It's a complex conversation, and we need to move towards focusing on positive and not on negative. And so I think there's a little bit of a danger now that we get into negative responses rather than positive responses to community policing. And I hope we can avoid that.
Representative, this is a big conversation. We could have another hour and there would still be more to talk about. And I hope you'll come back on the show and we'll talk about it more. But I do have one perhaps related, but not directly related, and that is the budget in Lansing, which some of could impact what we're talking about here today. But in a larger sense, how concerned are you about putting a budget together when you don't really have all the revenue numbers yet? You don't know what the federal government's going to do. And last year, in better times, it was not easy to come up with a budget. What's your take on this year?
Oh, I mean, my concern level here is about a 9 out of 10. This is an extremely perilous point for us. It's extremely perilous. I mean, it's shocking to think how much financial strain our education system alone is under right now. So I really devoutly hope that we get some federal assistance here. I mean, if the federal government is willing to devote trillions of dollars to help for business, I certainly hope that they could devote a fraction of that to stabilizing state budgets, because state budgets do a lot of things that help businesses. They keep roads operating, they keep our kids being educated. So if we're going to build for the future, we really need state government. I also think that's one of the reasons it's imperative we talk about keeping our economy moving safely, so that we already have plans in place and best practices so that we're not crippled by a second wave. Because at the end of the day, where does our revenue come from? It comes from business activity. So the sooner we can get people safely back to work and the more we can sustain that, the tougher our choices are going to, the fewer tough choices we're going to have to make. And yeah, it's a very, very concerning situation right now.
And LaGrand's not alone in his concern about the budget, because it's not just this year's budget, but this year and next. The revenue estimations could be way off because we don't know how or if the economy is going to come back. And what if the federal government doesn't come through with the money that both the legislature and the governor are hoping for? That could make for a much, much bigger problem. And it's something we'll be following throughout the summer. And we'll be back in a moment with more To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. This week we're talking with lawmakers from Lansing in their response to the demonstrations and the voices that have been crying out for changes in the criminal justice system, in policing, and so much more. This morning, Republican Representative BRANDT Iden from Kalamazoo County talks to us about what he's hearing from his constituents.
As I'm sure a lot of viewers have seen, and I know that your station has covered it, we've obviously had those same protests in Kalamazoo that other communities have also seen. Very peaceful for the most part in nature. There was some minor crime, I would say, comparatively compared to other communities, breaking of windows, a few things like that. But really, we were able to keep that under control in Kalamazoo. But those protests continue for the exact reason that you just mentioned, Rick, and that is, people are looking for a systemic change to the system. And I think it's incumbent upon the legislature to begin that conversation and begin to have those conversations.
Iden says it's time for an important conversation. Already in Lansing, one bill has been passed in the Senate that would change the way police officers are trained, but he says it's time for that bigger conversation, and I ask, how does that start?
As you mentioned, we have taken some initial legislative action, and I think that there'll be more to come as it relates to specific legislative things that we can deal with. And a lot of things that the protesters are calling for are things that I think that we can come together on in some ways. For example, as some of the conversations have occurred around making sure that there are more social opportunities to engage and have those kinds of conversations about racism in our communities, that needs to be driven by leaders in communities like legislators, those that have a voice, those that can get out there and sort of in the front and say, okay, let's see what that conversation looks like. Now, we also know that it's part of as it relates to police departments in particular and law enforcement, and I know that that's a driving force in the conversation. It starts with hiring. We know that we have to have good hiring protocols to make sure that there isn't systemic racism within the system. And I actually think, I know that there's been a lot of calls about defunding departments and things like that. I actually think that that's problematic. I actually think that what we should be looking at is how can we fund these departments better to give folks more training about how to deal with not only these situations, but make sure that they're hiring the right officers, that we're going through the right HR protocols to make sure that we don't have people that we're hiring that have prejudices perhaps to anyone. We need these law enforcement officers out on the street. We have to support these officers. We have to have law and order in our communities. But at the same time, I think that if we better funded these departments to be able to give people actual education and training in these situations, we'd probably be better off. So I actually think it's counterintuitive for the folks out there to be saying defund departments. I just don't think it makes a lot of sense. There are ways that we can do social programs in municipalities. I just don't think that those dollars come from law enforcement. In fact, like I say, we need more robust dollars to make sure that we have good training out there.
When you think about the legislative action that you may take, and you just there, we're talking about dollars, part of the issue will be money, and there are some that will say that there isn't enough money that is coming into law enforcement, and people worry about state budgets that don't necessarily fund public safety at the level that they would like. That could become problematic too, couldn't it, if you need to put more money into training programs at a time when the state's budget is going to be under a lot of pressure?
We're going to have, yeah, that's a great point. We're going to have a lot of pressures on our state budget as we look to obviously rounding out this fiscal year that we're currently dealing with. There'll be a supplemental we're working on currently. Then we jump right back in the summer. Now we're going to be discussing the next fiscal year. And we recognize that there's a shortfall there. By most estimates, we've seen a little over $3 billion. We certainly hope that when Congress reconvenes in July, we'll get some support from them. I'm hearing positive things from our local delegation that they're going to be supportive of trying to get the state dollars so we can get some of those dollars into the community. You're absolutely right that we will have pressures on the budget, but at the same time, one of the only ways, as I reiterate, to sort of fix these systemic problems is more education as we deal with those law enforcement officers out there on the street. In order to do that, it's going to take more dollars. Now, we do have those pressures on the system, but it's important, and we recognize how important it is because we see our streets and our communities packed with people wanting change, and that means it's incumbent upon the legislature to take that action.
Well, let's talk a little bit about why the budget looks the way it does. It's no secret to anybody watching, certainly no secret to anybody in the legislature, that with the lack of economic activity in the state because of the COVID-19 and the requirements for many businesses not to be open at all and others to be limited, the revenue from taxes just hasn't been there. Not to mention that the deadline for an income tax was pushed back. So you don't know exactly what that revenue is going to look like from last year either. So all of those things mean that you have this budget shortfall, and you still won't necessarily know, even when you pass the supplemental, what the total revenues are going to be. So you're, to some degree, flying a little in the dark, aren't you?
We absolutely are. Now, I was very happy to see the unemployment projection numbers came in much better than where we thought they were going to be statewide and nationwide. That means people are going back to work, and that's very good news. There was a lot of concern initially that some of these jobs may not be there, and I recognize that a lot of them may not be there. But the good news is that some of them still are. People are recognizing the importance of getting back into the workforce, and that's going to be helpful right here in Michigan. We've seen that with auto manufacturing, which we know drives a tremendous amount of our economy and thus our state budget. But there is that apprehension that we're all going to have going into this budget cycle of just how do we budget for some of the unknown with or without these federal dollars. And I think we have to go in, hoping that we get the federal dollars, but at the same time, knowing what are we going to do if we don't. And that is going to mean cuts. That's going to mean department cuts. That's going to mean probably some across the board cuts in different areas of state government. And I know it's going to be tough. But the good news is that, and I come back to those unemployment numbers only because if the economy rebounds like we're hoping it may, and we are working on that very diligently to make sure that we are putting ourselves in a position to give our businesses the right foot forward to come back strong. If we do that, we may be able to get through those 3 down months that we've had of just no economic activity whatsoever. Going to be tough, but I think we can get it done.
What's the cooperation level like, given the animosity that has either been there or developed between the legislature and the governor during this pandemic?
Well, like anything, whenever two parties disagree and it goes to the courts, they sort of stop talking to each other, and that's been disappointing. However, we are working towards that. Obviously, we know our challenge as it relates to the state of emergency falls in the hands of the Supreme Court now. Once we get through the appeals court level, it will eventually end up there, and we're going to work through that process. But at the same time, there is legislative work that needs to get done. There's policy work. There's appropriations work that needs to be to get done. The good news is that I don't think it's as tense as it was. As the governor has eased some of those orders, it has made conversations, I think, easier for for members on both sides of the aisle that have heard from their community, folks in their communities that have been upset about certain things. It does make it a little bit easier when the pressure is not necessarily directly on those members, and they can come to Lansing and sort of be more open-minded about having those conversations. The good news is we recognize, all sides recognize, that this has to be a cooperative effort to get this done together. If we don't work together to get this done, we are going to fall flat on our faces, and we cannot let that happen. And I think sides, even though it was a little tense there a month or so ago when we first started the initial proceedings, I think the good news is that sides are talking, and we're working slowly to move the ball forward, which I think is good.
And finally, Representative, I'm a little late to the dance on this one, so forgive me, but you've worked for years to develop some type of an online gaming proposal that finally has come to fruition. I know it's still being implemented. Where are we on that, and what does it look like going forward?
Well, certainly in the era of COVID and post-COVID, as our casinos remain closed throughout the state, and now just recently, some of them have started to bring people back. Some of our tribal casinos have started to bring people back in limited capacity. Online gaming will be crucial to make sure that those tax revenue dollars come in, especially in the city of Detroit, where those casinos have been closed for 3 months, and there's been no contribution from those casinos to the city. Will be difficult, and that will be part of the shortfall of the budget. So the good news is that we're moving forward. I hope to be up online with gaming by the end of the year. I believe the Gaming Control Board is diligently working on this, recognizing the era that we're in and that people are going to be using their mobile devices more to be playing. And so the good news is that I certainly hope by football season, we're going to be able to place some of those bets. I don't know about the Lions, but we're going to at least be able to place the bets.
So lawmakers have plenty to do this summer, dealing with the issues that we've talked about here this morning, and of course, dealing with the budget. The budget will be a problem this year and next. And when I come back, we'll have a final thought about money matters in Lansing. Next, To the Point. So now the legislature finds itself grappling with two budgets at one time. And now a governor and set of legislators that don't particularly get along when it comes to budgets will have to make some big decisions. It's something I'll be watching throughout the summer. We'll see you next Sunday morning. To the Point.